Hello folks, and welcome to the channel, and in this video we're going to work on the Stadman TS100. Not that I wanted to work on it, but I had no choice. And we've been driving around for about an hour or two, and it's going up and downhill, and at one moment in time we had a fairly steep hill, and the car had a problem getting up there. It was revving up, but it didn't have the torque anymore. So I suspected immediately a problem with the automatic gearbox. Now, cars behind me, they were flashing their lights because I left behind a trail of oil and I had lost my transmission oil. That is why the torque converter didn't work anymore, the gearbox didn't work anymore, so I had to pull aside and we had to tow it home. And here it is. And to me, it doesn't make a lot of sense that this gearbox went faulty because it did work fine before. So I want to find out why this all in a sudden happened. I know the weather was a little bit warmer. We had some small hills to go up and down, but there was not a lot of load on the car. So let's have a look on the car and see if there is anything that could indicate that something is done, because I did not put that gearbox into this car, so maybe we overlooked something. So let's have a look what the issue could be, because I've been trying this car before several times without any issues, and I'm a bit surprised that we have that issue right now. So we have some of those inspection holes here, and this is just plastic you can remove, and inside you can already see the torque converter. And I suspect the oil came out here, as you can see. Let me just sense inside. Now look at this. Yeah, this is full of oil. So I suspect that either the torque converter is having a leak, although I don't see much on it, or the seal on the main input shaft inside that goes into the automatic gearbox. Now the automatic gearbox sits right here, and this is a Borg Warner Type 66. It's a 3-speed gearbox, typically fitted to the XJ6 Jaguars, the 6 and the 8 cylinders on the series 1, 2 and 3. In the front we got the bell housing, and inside we have the torque converter. Now the torque converter is nothing more than a clutch system, but then driven by hydraulics. So basically oil is spinning back and forth. You got an impeller and then you have a turbine. The impeller is driven by the flywheel, and then it spins oil out, it hits the turbine, and then the turbine starts spinning, and the turbine actually drives the gearbox. In between you also have a stator to redirect the oil in the most optimum way, and this is kind of a clutch system as well. On the stator it can turn in one direction, not in the other direction. But anyway, I'm not going to give a full explanation here on how a on how a torque converter works. There's plenty of YouTube movies where you can see on how all that works. Now what we will have to do is now to remove this complete gearbox from underneath the car. Automatic transmission systems heat up fairly quickly, especially under load, and you want to control that heat of that cooling liquid, and that is why we need to cool it. And in most cases that is being done with an air-to-oil cooler. It's kind of a heat exchanger. Other systems are using a water oil cooled system, and they're using the cooling system of the engine to cool down actually the oil of the transmission fluid. The Jaguar XJ6 Series 1, 2 and 3 are using exactly that last system. On the board we have a simplified diagram of the XJ6 cooling system. First of all, we've got the radiator on the top, and that is responsible for cooling down the engine. On the bottom we have the automatic gearbox, and we have some hoses connected to the heat exchanger. These are the red lines. So when the engine is cold and you start up the engine, then it's important that the engine heats up fast enough, and that's when you will see the thermostat playing in. So the green stuff is what we call actually the cooling liquid for the engine. So the temperature of that will go up fairly quickly. So let's say when you start up, it's going to heat up quickly and up to about 70 degrees centigrade, and then the thermostat will open up. But normal running conditions would be around 80, 90 degrees centigrade, some maybe 100 degrees centigrade. Now the oil in the automatic gearbox is actually not warmed up from the start. It's cold. and it's going to warm up by the heat exchange because the water or the cooling liquid for the radiator is heating up fairly fast, and the automatic gearbox oil is still cold. So you're going to see a transfer from the actual heat of the cooling system of the engine towards the oil of the automatic gearbox. So the automatic gearbox oil will warm up initially, so it's going to go up in temperature. While we are driving and we put some load on the automatic gearbox, the temperature of the gearbox will increase. So that will go up quite fast if you load the car a lot. You're going uphill, there's a heavy load on it, so that temperature will really go up quickly on the automatic gearbox oil. If it goes above the temperature of the cooling liquid for the engine, then the heat exchanger is just going to work the other way around. It's going to transfer like so. So the heat of the oil from the automatic gearbox will now be transferred actually to the water of the cooling system of the engine. And this is how we now can deal with this. Now we have a mechanism that does two things. It allows the automatic gearbox to warm up fast enough so that oil is at the right temperature, and secondly, it's going to allow that oil to be cooled down once it's getting too hot. So this is a pretty nice system, but it has one major drawback. If you have a puncture anywhere in this heat exchanger, you're going to get cooling liquid getting into your automatic gearbox oil. And when that happens, you really are in trouble, because then you will destroy your automatic gearbox. So that's why a lot of people don't like these kind of heat exchangers, and they refer back to a air oil cooled system. But on the Jaguar, this is what we have. So now let's have a look where that is and see if we have an issue there, because I have the impression that this car started an issue with overheating. And if I look under the car, then I can see this tube here, and this is supposed to be the heat exchanger for the automatic gearbox. You can see a big hose coming in here. This is going to the radiator, and the other side is also going to the radiator. But what I am missing really is the little connections for the oil coming from the automatic gearbox. That doesn't make a lot of sense. There is something wrong with this. So in other words, it doesn't look like I have cooling done. And look what they've done. They connected a loop. So basically they've taken the hot oil coming from the gearbox and they loop it straight back in. So in other words, there isn't a lot of cooling going on. It's supposed to connect to the exchanger, heat exchanger, but it isn't. So somebody in his own mind decided that this is a good solution, and it's not. So most likely, this is the real cause why we run into a problem with the automatic transmission system. So there's a couple of things we now have to do before we remove the gearbox. First of all, we need to lift up the car and or place it on a stand, because we're going to lower it down from underneath. That is always the best approach. But before you do so, we will have to, of course, disconnect the speedometer cable. We will have to disconnect the kickdown cable. We'll have to connect the lever or the speed selector. And then we have to disconnect those oil pipes that we just looked at. And we need to loosen up the bolts that are holding the drive shaft to the rear end of the gearbox. And then finally we'll have to unlock 4 bolts that are holding the torque converter onto the flywheel. And that's a little bit tricky because it's very much fiddling in between. You have to remove some panels to get to it. Depends a bit on the gearbox you have. But on this one, it's not too bad. Once we've done that, then we will unlock the bolts around the bell housing, and then of course support actually the gearbox all the time, and also the engine, so it doesn't tilt, because you don't want to bend anything. And then we'll pull it back gently, hopefully, and then we can lower down the gearbox and have a closer look on it. So this is our speedometer cable, which we're going to remove now, and it's not very tight in this case. The next thing I'm going to remove is the dipstick pipe. Now, there will be oil coming out of this one for sure, so be careful when you do so, because you've got to drain the oil anyway, so keep that in mind. So the next thing we need to do is to remove the drive shaft from the rear end of the gearbox, and therefore I'm going to put a marker up, okay? So I can install it exactly the same way as we disconnected it. And removing the drive shaft is not all that complicated. You just need to undo these bolts, and there's in total, I think, 4 bolts. Drive shaft is now disconnected, and I just hope that we have enough play in between here to lower that automatic gearbox, because I can't get it any further down, and I can't drop it because there's a metal plate in the way. The next thing is to disconnect the selector for the gears, and that's this rod right here, and this is keyed, so all I need to do is undo the bolt and then slide it off. Next, I'm going to remove the cooling pipes. There's a couple of bolts, there's one there, there's one further down, and then 2 more connections on the gearbox itself. That shouldn't be all that difficult. And on the gearbox, you also have the 2 oil pipes. Already undid one, so now it's time for the second one to be undone. This was tough, and it slipped. Now it is loose. There we go. Disconnected, finally. And I don't know if you can see it, folks, but right there, that's where the kickdown cable is. So that's another one we will need to remove. So we are about ready to lower the gearbox out of the car, and what I've done is I supported the car extra with some extra pillars, as you can see. There's one right here as well, and the reason for that is that the bridge that I use is a 2-pillar bridge, and it's okay and it's heavy enough, but this is a heavy car, and if we're going to jiggle around with the gearbox, I don't want the car to fall down or slip off that bridge. So that's why I always like to put extra supports up. Safety first, right? You better be safe than sorry. Now, if we go in to lower down the gearbox, you're going to need some jack of some sort, unless you are a real powerful guy, and I'm not. So I'm using this kind of a jack, which is for gearboxes and differentials. It's hydraulic, so you actually can pump it up, and then of course you can lower it down as well, and it will come down on its own weight. So this is a pretty good tool to have, and this is what we're going to use. I made a wooden block on top of this so I can support the gearbox at the best possible place to keep it in balance, but you'll see that once we start lowering it. But before we lower the gearbox, we need to disconnect the torque converter from the flywheel, and for that I have to undo 4 bolts in a very awkward place. To remove the torque converter, you will have to release 4 bolts, and these are not easy to get at. Typically, you will have to face them from the front side of the bell housing. Now, on some of these Jaguars, you will find a metal plate bolted onto the actual bell housing, and on the front you have your engine, and in the back you have your transmission. And if you take that off with these 4 bolts, then you can lower that, and then you can see right there these bolts that are holding the torque converter onto the flywheel, and there are 4 of them. You can get to it, not that hard, and you'll see this is how I do it, because I have the car lifted up. But there's also another way. You might also want to remove your starter motor and then have access through that opening. I have removed the starter from the engine. It's only held in place with 2 bolts, so that was easy to remove. You also have to remove, of course, the plus 12 volts lead, and then the enable lead, which is coming from your contact to activate the solenoid. But once you've done that, you can then remove the starter, and through the opening you can actually see these bolts on the flywheel that are holding down the torque converter. You may have to spin around the engine a bit to see them, but you'll see them. So you could actually unbolt that through this opening here. And you can also remove the bolts through the opening where the starter motor used to be. So this is the bell housing, and I removed this panel here, that metal plate, and now I have access to the bolts. And that's where one of the bolts used to be. I already took it out. This is the flywheel, and in the back of that you have the torque converter. So now I need to rotate the engine to make sure that I have the next bolt, and then we can unlock it. Try to rotate the engine now until we have the next one. And there it is, it's coming, I can see it. Yeah, that should be about it. Now you can see that there is a lip on there to prevent the bolt from coming loose, so you need to knock this away and then unbolt it. I won't be able to show you that because I will be in the way. But I'm just going to use a small chisel and flatten this out, and then I just unlock the bolt. So that's where the bolt is, and you can see I can just get in between. All right, that's it. Okay, and here it is. And these are the 4 bolts that are holding down the torque converter to the flywheel. And here we have the kickdown cable, which is connected to the carburetor linkage, and we'll have to remove this cable right here because I can't remove it actually on the gearbox itself while the gearbox is in place. So let me get this cotter pin out. All right. And I also have to undo this locking nut, and then we can actually remove the gearbox. There are 4 more bolts to be released on the bell housing on this side and 4 on the other side. I already removed 4 bolts on the top of the engine when the car was on the ground, but before I do so, I need to support the engine, and I will have to support the gearbox. All right. So I'm going to support the back end of the engine, and this is actually the oil sump or the oil pan with a adjustable support. It doesn't need a lot of force, but I still want to have it underneath there so I can actually adjust the... So I'm going to support the engine in the back, and I'm going to place this adjustable spanner. So if I'm removing the gearbox from the engine, then the engine will actually flip down. So I need to support it, and this is a pretty good tool to do that. All right, so I'm going to tighten that up a bit, not too much. And I'm doing it at the end of the oil pan where it's at its strongest point, and this is an aluminum oil pan, so that should be all right. Let's see. Right, I don't think I need to push it more. That should be good enough. And I'm also going to support the gearbox, and I made a piece of wood, as you can see, that fits right in here, lifting up the gearbox in the back, and in the front it's lifting it actually on the bell housing. I don't want to lift here on this oil pan because that's way too soft material. So let me put it in, and then we'll see where it brings us, right? And I'm using this hydraulic jack because that is very handy to use for this kind of work. We're almost there. I just want to make sure I have it in the middle. Okay. Right, so I'm going to undo these bolts, and then we can lower the gearbox. I'm not going to show you on how I'm removing all these bolts because it's pretty straightforward stuff to do. While I'm doing so, I'm going to keep an eye on both the engine support but also on the gearbox support. I want to make sure that all that is just fitting nicely and in place, stays in place as it should. So I've been jiggling around a bit with the gearbox, and it actually separated. The only problem is I can't get far enough to the back. Because here in the back, I'm having a metal panel which is actually in the way. Right. As you can see, not everything goes as smooth as you might think sometimes. Now I can't get the gearbox out because I can't create enough clearance to shift it enough backwards so I can free up the flywheel so I can lower it down. And the reason for that is that there is a metal bracket connecting the two cross members. It's a very small metal plate, but that's just on the tail of the gearbox and I can't lower it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut that little piece out and I'll show it to you once it's been cut out, and then later on we weld the new one back in. I think when they put this car together, they must have moved it in from the top. There's no other way they could have done it. There's no way they could have done it from below. So let's go and start grinding it off. That's the part I was talking about. So I'm going to grind it off and then later on we'll put a new one up. That's the only way I can do it. And here is that little piece. That's the part that was in my way. Not a very thick piece of metal, and I'm just going to weld on a new one once the gearbox is back in. Yeah, I think that should all pass. Let's see. Yeah. And it's coming down. All right, so we got the gearbox from underneath the car. It took me a bit longer to take the gearbox out of the car than I expected, but that's always how it goes when you work on cars, especially cars that are not very standard. So let us have a look what kind of gearbox this really is. So this is a Model 66 Borg Warner gearbox, and it's a 3-speed gearbox, and I have even a serial number on it. So that is good. So with this orange plate now I could probably order all the parts to rebuild the gearbox. And inside the bell housing we got what we call the torque converter, and that's the guy. So we're going to take this out and we're also going to get this one reconditioned. And this is a heavy guy. So this is inside the bell house, and you can see that we got some oil leaks coming out. And if you look closely on this seal here, I can see it's bent. Here we have a major bend on it. So I suspect that a lot of the oil loss was due to this problem here. Now there's a couple of things I can now do with the gearbox. I can either disassemble it and rebuild it myself, and you can get all these parts, or I give it to a automatic transmission shop and let them build it. And I think I'm going to do the last one because I am not too familiar with these automatic gearboxes, certainly not this one. And it's a lot of work to rebuild it and then put it back in and then finding out that it doesn't work. So I'm going to take the bell house off. I'm going to get my torque converter rebuilt or refurbished by the same company I'm going to. And I also will ask them to rebuild the gearbox itself. I suspect that one of the discs is gone, or multiple discs are gone inside for one of the gears, because I had no more torque, even though after I filled it up with oil, but it was leaking like hell. All right. So let's have a look how the sump looks like. We're going to have some oil coming out of it. All right. Oh, ugly. All right. I can see a lot of metal particles in it. And here we have a magnet, and look at this, which is supposed to be inside, and it will attract all kind of metal particles, and that's the intent. And here we have our kickdown cable, so I will remove that one. And this is how the sump looks like. Really dirty, a lot of debris in it. And this is what you get when you don't change your filter often enough. So while we're at it, we might as well have a quick look on the oil filter. There's only 4 screws to undo. I'm just curious to see what state it is in, because I haven't changed it yet. I was planning to change it, but disaster struck before I was able to change it. Alright, let's have a look how that looks like. Yeah, it's not too bad, I guess. So that's the kind of filter we then need to replace. So folks, we are at the end of this video, and I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did. But to be honest, I didn't enjoy too much removing the automatic gearbox. It was a lot of work, but we got it out, and in the next episode you'll see it when it comes back, and then we're going to reinstall it and then adjust it and test it out. But in between, we'll make some other videos. Thank you for viewing, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye bye.